go. All right, folks, we are nearing the end. And so today we have another one of the classic Genesis interludes with a bit of the lineage of where we're going, kind of sandwiched in between story pieces. So let's go ahead and jump in and see where the story is taking us and see if we can pull out any interesting details from this. I don't know if this is the last lineage we're gonna get, but it's one. It may be. Anyways, so let's do a little bit of recap. What happened last time? How did the reveal and the reunion go?
Great.
Yeah.
Arrow thought it was great too.
Yeah. Yeah, even Pharaoh liked it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have to say, how likely is that?
So the gig is up. Joseph finally said, "Here I am, brothers." And the last we heard is that go back, go get Dad. Pharaoh's sending a bunch of wagons and chariots. We're going to bring the whole family here because if you remember, there's 5 years left in the famine, and 5 years of nothing to eat is a long time. So we have grain reserves here. Come on down. And so we left off with the last line is from Jacob himself saying, "Enough, my son Joseph is alive. I must go and see him before I die." And that brings us to chapter 46 today. And so if you all notice, this is one of the times where Jacob and Israel is used for the same person, but they keep switching back and forth between those two names. If it's a little bit confusing, I understand. This is one of the hallmarks, just as a reminder, that they're stitching sources together, because so this is a sign that this is a common piece of the story, that both versions of kind of the Joseph story have this likely in it, and it's likely been stitched together. And the fact that it switches so quickly back and forth means probably the two sources had very similar versions of how this went down. So, Mary Ellen, was that a almost hand or no? Okay. All right. All right. So we just let's go ahead and jump in. So Israel set off on the journey, but there is a pause when he goes to Beersheba. Beersheba is a name we recognize at this point, right? We've crossed through this a few times. I didn't look at the cross references, but things have been sacrificed at Beersheba before.
Is it a shrine or is it actually a village?
Let's see.
It's a
At
place.
the altar, Isaac. So Isaac built an altar.
Altar. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where Rachel is buried?
I would have to look that up. It's not in my notes that that's the case, but I don't actually know. Where is Rachel buried?
I think it is.
So Rachel's buried outside of Bethlehem.
Oh, okay. But
which
another
is, I believe, what was that?
I think there was another wife buried. Somebody was buried near one of those.
Didn't Jacob buy a cave on one of his trips? You know, and he buried somebody there, and then they buried somebody else there later on.
Yeah.
There's a few places that have very similar names to Beersheba. There's Bethsheba and
okay.
That's Bathsheba. There's another place that has a very similar sounding name.
Okay.
At any rate, so we at least know that this name is familiar. So this is a shrine that has been visited before by the Holy Family here. And so this is the point where God speaks to Israel in a vision that night. And we kind of hear some of this classic interchange, should be fairly familiar by this point, of calling out Jacob, or God spoke to Israel in a vision, Jacob, Jacob, and Jacob says, here I am.
Mm.
And then God says, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt. I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's own hand will close your eyes.
Yeah,
So what are some of the details? Because there's some things in here that are familiar from the covenant that we've been talking about all along. And then there's some new things in here. So what do we see in this promise of God? Yeah, Larry?
One thing that struck me was God's statement that I will go down there
Yeah.
with you, which sort of implies, well, I'm not always around, you know. I'm not always with you.
Right.
it's not, he certainly isn't God of the whole world.
Correct. Yeah.
So this is, I'm going to call you back to our, like, one of our third discussions when thinking about the difference in our creation stories and how they work. Because one of them was that very omnipresent, God speaks and the world comes into being. The other creation story is God walking around in a garden and having footsteps, being very locational. And we've seen this theme come up again. And so here we are, kind of at the concluding area of Genesis. And the version of God we're getting in this point is, I will go, which is a very locationally based kind of phrase of God is moving with people, almost with the idea of like walking around, kind of like we saw at the very beginning of the story.
Yes. But is it, in this particular chapter, is it the priestly version and the J version that are mixed? Are those?
It would be the upper and the lower kingdoms.
Well, I was thinking that the priestly guys are always doing genealogies.
So that's coming up in a bit. So the genealogy is, but the narrative story part, I believe it's the northern kingdom, which would be the E source.
Okay, E source.
The E source is Elohim, which is when the generic term God is used, versus the holy name. The holy name is based more in the southern version. Helen, yeah?
I know. It says that the priestly list is in numbers at the bottom of at the page.
Okay.
But a different place. I just noticed priestly, so I didn't pay attention to where it was.
Okay. Yeah, there's many versions. There's many parts stitched together here.
Yeah.
Helen, you had a question, but you're also on mute.
I was wondering if some of this location business with God might be the way the early people expressed the nearness of God. There were a lot, I mean, they aren't like us exactly. They had different culture, different way of looking at things. And maybe the way they expressed it and wrote about it later was more to help people understand that God does come with them, but it's closeness, I think. But I'm just wondering if that's because of the way they were, that they expressed it that way.
Mm-hmm. That is a lovely way to think about it. And there's definitely some things that we see evidenced in scripture of that being exactly the case. So if we go into Exodus, we will see a lot of God's location mattering in how. This is one of the things that we hear a lot of summaries of the 10 plagues, but if you actually dive into the language of them, you will see God's location matters. Also in the wilderness, like God is with the people in a very like tangible, God is here. But then much later on, when you're talking more of the kingdoms, you will see that they bring the Ark of the Covenant onto the battlefield because God's location matters and the troops want to feel like God is close. And since the Ark of the Covenant is seen as God's footstool, by carrying it onto the battlefield itself, it's in essence kind of saying like, God is here with us. Look, he's standing right over there. So there is a sense of like wanting God to be tangible and close.
It sounds like the level of abstraction that we have now in talking about God, or they did at the end of it, it wasn't there yet.
That is likely the case, that understanding God to be present everywhere is this kind of omnipotent force. That does take that is a much later development. We see it kind of in progress at points.
Yes.
But the thought is that a lot of this does kind of come out of that polytheistic worldview where, yeah, gods are locational. Like, to use a bad example here, like Zeus has a personhood and like moves around. So we're not at that level of like assuming that like that the gods are like walking around with us, but it seems like one level of abstraction that like we can't see God, but God is still has a personhood that's interacting in a much more tangible way than kind of our omnipotent sky daddy for in that like guy with the beard in the sky kind of idea that we have more that developed later on. So going back to the formulation, the promises here, any other observation of what God is promising to Jacob in this moment? Yeah, Mary Ellen.
Let me see. Still in verse 4. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again. I am reading into this, and I could be way off, but is the bring you up again that when he dies, God will bring him up? Or what is this contrast here?
Mm-hmm. So this is something that has 2 layers, and I love, if someone didn't ask about this, I was going to point it out. Okay. This is a very important detail, both because it prefigures the Exodus. There's a sense of the people of God, like God has promised the promised land. And so they are actively leaving that part of the covenant in order for survival, but they will go back. So there's a sense of this land promise of you are leaving part of the promise behind, but don't worry, I am going to bring you back to that location.
Okay.
There's one of my classes that I took, my professor, Dr. McWhirter, had us pay attention when we're studying this. She had us pay attention of what part of the covenant is currently enacted. So you have descendants, you have land, and you have blessing. And so for a little bit of time, like we've been paying attention to Joseph, but if you're paying attention to the other brothers, they are actively in the land. They have descendants. It no longer is like, do we have kids? That's no longer in jeopardy. The blessing is kind of in question because it seems like Joseph is the one who is carrying on the blessing part, but they are still thought of as being blessed. But now they're about to be blessed in Egypt, but not have the land. Eventually, when the kingdoms are in play, they will have the land, they will have the descendants, but then with the exile, the question is if they lost the blessing of God, and that's why the kingdoms attacked. When at the beginning of the story, they may have been in the land and they may have been a blessing, but all the descendants were in question. So you can kind of see like the question of which part of the covenant is missing.
Oh.
And so this is a promise that I have not forgotten the covenant. You're going to lose the land. You're going to move out of it, but you will come back.
Okay.
The second part of this is a promise to Jacob himself.
Yeah.
And so he is going to die in Egypt.
Yeah.
And I'm going to just let you in on a little secret right now. In Exodus, there is a specific place where they as they're gathering up to flee Egypt after all the firstborns die, someone grabs Jacob's bones and they literally carry him out. And this promise is remembered, and Jacob's bones are carried out of Egypt with everything else. And the story does not forget about him. So it is promised to Jacob himself as well that he will go out of Egypt.
Wow.
So that's just a really cool detail. But that comes much, much later in Exodus, but it's one of those really cool callbacks of very clear foreshadowing here that doesn't come into play much, much, much later in the story. So the last thing in this promise that I think is always good to pay attention to, the part that we've seen before, the familiar part is, I will make of you a great nation. This is part of that of the original covenant again, but we will see that in the in-between time between Genesis and Exodus, the people of God go from being one family to an actual nation. So this is one of those other things that is prefiguring the story to come. This is where you very much see that the authors are making the transition to telling the story of the Exodus. They're setting up the next book. The conclusion for kind of the Genesis story has already happened. The Holy Family has kind of come together. We're going to see how all the last steps. But from now on, we're kind of actually getting ready for Exodus. And how do we get from here to there? And so this is one of the other things that is getting us ready for the transition. Is it's not just that you will have lots of descendants. We are getting prepped for, there is going to be a nation of people. This is going to be beyond just this family.
Okay.
So with that, we that's the promises. And Jacob continues on from Beersheba, and we kind of get a little bit of an inventory of what actually they decided to take. If you remember, Pharaoh said, forget about everything and just come. They're bringing some of their stuff along. So what do we see that they decided to pack and take with them?
It sounds like almost everything,
It does.
including their livestock.
Mm-hmm. Right. Helen, did you have a comment? Ooh, check your mute again.
You're muted.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to mute it every now and then because there's a vacuum going on.
Oh, okay.
And so anyway, yeah, but I forget what I was going to say about it, but he's taking everything, their cattle and their goods and their wives and their children. And I mean, they must have quite a group there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, Larry?
Well, it's going to take quite a while to get from where they're starting to where they end up. And they're going to have to eat and have provisions and so forth. So they've got to take a lot of stuff with them. There aren't any McDonald's to stop at along the way. They've got to make their own.
Verse 6 says they brought their livestock and all their belongings accumulated in the land of Canaan, with Jacob and all his children, sons, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters, and loved ones. And Pharaoh gave him enough food for the trip back, along with giving him a lot of stuff to take.
Yeah, they don't want to be absorbed into Egypt either, I don't think.
Well, I don't think the Egyptians want them either much because they don't like the shepherds and
Right.
didn't want them to be around them.
That's
Right.
weird.
So let's not forget that these are fundamentally nomadic people at this point in time. To say come to Egypt, it's okay, let's pack up the caravan. We're just almost like saying, oh, to like Mary Ellen, you're with us. So the thing that comes to mind, if you're telling a group of people who like have motorhomes to like leave all the things behind and like come visit, like they're gonna drive their motorhomes and just like all of their like that's telling them to leave everything behind is actually kind of silly because these people are used to packing up and moving. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
They also need subsistence when they get there.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So naturally, they would take a lot. They don't know what Pharaoh is going to provide for them. They don't know if it'll be what they want him to provide for him.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're going prepared.
Right. So, flipping the story around though, what problem might this cause?
So they're leaving behind. I think there's got to be people they're leaving behind, and they're not going to be providing grain and goods from the Pharaoh, to the people behind them. They're abandoning them.
Yeah. I mean, we've kind of talked about the local economy that this band of people likely had, and they had trade relations that we've seen on and off of. They're leaving the cities behind, so they're no longer good trading partners because they're like, see y'all later. Find your meat elsewhere because we're taking our food with us.
Mhm.
What problems are going to happen if they're taking everything they have, like all of their wealth included, and showing up in Egypt? What problems might we anticipate when they arrive?
Are they arriving in Goshen, or are they are they arriving into the, kind of a wilderness remote area, or are they arriving where there's an existing community?
So they're arriving in the Goshen, which we saw on the map is it's part of the Nile Delta. It's one of the greener areas, but it wasn't uninhabited. It's not like this is untouched land here. There is desert on the other side of it. So if people live somewhere, it's going to be in the green area. And here's this big band of people arriving with a bunch of livestock. It sounds like they've collected a fair amount of gold and other wealth from Canaan that they're bringing with them. And they're showing up. Yeah, Larry?
How big is this band of people? They say there were 70.
70, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's not huge. I mean, that's not an invasion. Now,
True.
you got 70 people and lots of cows and sheep, and so forth. But
They're gonna want a lot of space for their livestock. They're gonna take up acres.
Yeah.
The question is how many, and we don't get record of this, is how many servants they're taking with them. Because as we talked about, there's people that they manage that we've seen kind of, we saw it more in the Abraham story that like Abraham had at least like 150 people under his employment or servitude, or however we want to discuss it. There are people besides the Holy Family, the Promise family here, but we only have record of the direct descendants. But there's likely, I would take an estimation to say there's more than just the people we have record of here.
Yeah.
If I were living in Goshen, I'm guessing that that's also an agricultural lifestyle. But having 70 people and all of their animals and all of their shepherds and servants and whatever move in on you would feel like an invasion. That the people who are already there have already found the prime spots to settle. And it sounds like they're going to be swept aside.
Or take over.
So this is the other part that is prefiguring what's going to happen. How do we get from this story where the family is moving in, they have a lot of animals and a lot of wealth? How do they get to be servants in Egypt? And this is one of the factors that we're going to see issues come up. because this isn't just like a family of 4 moving into town. This is a sizable amount of people, and it's we've also gotten hints that each of the brothers may have their own flocks as well at this point, and we've talked about how like they're established, they have their own families, which means this isn't just one herd that the 12 brothers are taking care of. Now this is more like 10 or 11 herds of animals coming to town. That's a lot.
Mhm.
And they have to eat the same food that people eat.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, wondered where all of that was gonna come from.
So we see, are we starting to see kind of the setup for the next problem?
Yeah.
Well, I read ahead.
So from this point, so that's kind of the setup for Exodus. But we kind of return to kind of what's happening with the family itself. So this is when we kind of switch into that priestly mode. Since the whole family's moving to town, we might as well keep records of who is in the family. Let's make sure we have all the names and all the details. And so we have a list of all the brothers, their children, and who's everyone's mother was. So did we see any interest? I don't want to walk through the whole lineage, but did we see any interesting details from reading it though? Anything in particular pop out?
Yeah, well, one thing is family is mother, father, and children. You know, and so it only goes and grandchildren. All right, let's see. Yeah, as far as Jacob is concerned, it's his kids and their kids, and that's what the family is.
Right.
And you don't count the wives except on the side.
Yeah.
Or the
They all-
concubines.
Well, sons are mentioned more than daughters, I notice.
Mm-hmm. But we do have record of daughters. All right,
Yeah.
I've seen Mary Ellen and Joe with their hands up.
But
Okay, well,
They also speak about the slave girl given to them and their children.
Mhm. Yeah, so if you remember his 4 different wives, we have the two that he actually married, and then the 2 servant girls who were given when it was all the baby drama. And Rachel sent her maiden, and Leah sent her maid, and so that's where we get those servant girls. All right,
Yeah.
Mary Ellen?
well, it also points out that I don't know how to say these, Zohar and Shaul, the son of a Canaanite woman. So now we're identifying her origin, and I have to believe that somehow that's significant.
You start to see, or what verse are you looking at for that one?
It's 10, I can't
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
get down on, but it's the last part of 10.
Oh, yeah.
A note about that? Interesting. So yeah, when you're not part of the original clan, evidently it's noted as such, because we also see Joseph's wife be tagged as the Egyptian woman. So we kind of see that there's a few other people making it into the fold as well.
Extended family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So a few other interesting ones. We do in verse 12, we do get the names of 2 people who died in Canaan and didn't make it to Egypt. In verse 15, there are some it's always good to like make sure we're paying attention to the women in the story. Helen, I think, was it you who said that the sons are mentioned more than the daughters? We do get some mention of some daughters here.
yes,
So this is 15, halfway through. We see Dinah be mentioned again. If you remember Dinah, who was avenged by her brothers, we see that she made it to Egypt. And all of his sons and his daughters numbered 33. That is a lot of daughters. So, yeah, that's a significant group of people that we just haven't really heard from. There's 33 daughters in the mix.
I don't think
Sons
it'll,
and daughters.
yeah.
Sons and daughters, yeah.
We want,
Oh,
don't,
his sons and his daughters. Anyways, okay, you're
okay.
right. My brain
Still a
skipped
bunch of
over.
them.
But that's still a lot of kids there. All right.
Mentions a sister.
Yep. In 17, we get the name of another sister.
In 12, oh yeah, in 17, I'm sorry, I couldn't see that.
Mhm,
But Joseph has the fewest children.
mhm.
He only has 2 sons.
He does.
He
And
was
it's
busy
interesting.
governing Egypt.
He and his sons are included in this community countdown, you know. They aren't seen as separate living the Egyptian lifestyle. You know, they're included.
Well,
So-
if Egypt has a different culture insofar as they don't have a bunch of concubines that whose children are legitimate in some ways.
Mhm.
I can't speak to that
Oh,
that
don't.
part of Egyptian culture. I'm gonna guess that there's some practices in the courts of Egypt that are pretty common to courts everywhere, just because kings and court officials do certain things. But Ephraim and Manasseh are the 2 sons of Joseph. And do either of those names kind of just sound familiar, if nothing else?
Manasseh.
Manasseh? Mm-hmm.
But the battle of something that sounds like,
Mhm.
is that related?
So why this comes up, and I've been racking my brain trying to figure out what it is. I can Google it, but in the end, when they return to the land of Canaan and they divide up the area in the different tribes and they say, you have this area, you have this area, Joseph doesn't get a tribe. Ephraim and Manasseh get land and tribes. And that's how Joseph is remembered in the clans of Israel when Israel becomes a nation. It's through his sons of Ephraim and Manasseh. And this comes up in our prophetic literature. They will talk about, I think Manasseh comes up more often, but these are his 2 sons, and those are the tribes of the 12 tribes of Egypt. How the tribes are divided up is a whole other story, and that comes much later, because there's a thing with Levi and what happens to the tribe of Levi and all these. There's a lot of drama surrounding it, and one person doesn't get a tribe in the end, and that drama we will see at the end of Genesis. But Ephraim and Manasseh come up in the prophetic literature if those names sound familiar at all. So. All right. So, the one last detail that I did find interesting, sometimes to see the daughters, you kind of have to do a little bit of math. In verse 22, you see, these are the children of Rachel who were born to Jacob, 14 people in all. We only have record of Rachel giving birth to 2, which has the question once again of where are the daughters? Or the other thing that I don't know, if the actually I take that back. The 14 people might be the inclusion of both the kids and the grandkids. I think that's actually how you get it. The kids and the grandkids are seen as the children of Jacob. There we go.
Yeah, right.
but still, if you count it up, there's more people in the 14 than we get for the sons. So there's daughters in the mix that we don't have names for. The last one is we have the children of Dan, and then in verse 25, we get these are the children of Bilhah, who was the other maid. And she bore, or with kids and grandkids, that amounts to 70 persons in all. So there at 2, we see the inclusion of some daughters. But then continuing on, all the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own offspring, not including the wives of his sons, were 66 persons. And the children of Joseph who were born to him in Egypt were 2. And the persons born to the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70, not including the wives. So, any thoughts on this? On any other thoughts on the lineage and the children and grandchildren here?
It was more than 70.
Yeah.
I'm- Were they good at counting?
I assume they were, but Mary Ellen, what were you gonna say?
Well, I'm startled by the mention of Leah and kind of lost some of the other names from, Laban gave to his daughter Leah and so on. I'm just kind of surprised they're still in the picture here. That I would have thought a lot more time would have passed, but they're all still together. And I don't know, I just find it startling that they're still, there.
So this might give a little bit of clarity that this is not actually saying that all of these people are alive. Because as we've seen, as we already know, Rachel has passed away already. There's not really record of Leah or the 2 maids if they're alive, but we know this is kind of out of time because specifically Benjamin has a family here. So this is more like we're gonna pause and say the family tree and just kind of have record. Oh, and don't forget, this is why this woman is in here, because she was a gift of Laban to the daughter, that, and kind of like a little bit of recounting. If you think of it more like if you have the family tree and sometimes there's notes, so like people later on can like, oh, this is the aunt that was treated like a sister and we're going to include her anyways. So they're more like footnotes of like who people are, just in case you forgot. So this isn't saying, that may actually be why when it says that this is 70 people, not including the wives, that may be because some of the wives are not living still.
Interesting.
So
Confusing.
right.
Did anybody count how many names are listed?
I did not. Did anyone actually count?
I thought about doing it, and then too much trouble.
After this, if someone wants to count the names, let us know. Let us know next time if it actually adds up. And if it adds up, then we know they only counted the sons. But if it doesn't, we can kind of get an idea of how many daughters are in the mix.
Yeah, and you wondered, how were those actual names preserved? I mean, who kept track of this? As
This would be entirely oral history.
Yeah.
And there is a book that I never actually finished the book, but it was very interesting. It was called Into the Shallows, and it was talking about like how the internet changes our brains. But it didn't just jump to how the internet changes our brains. It actually first talked about how reading changes our brains and how our brains adapt to different tools and how different things become a problem or not. Like an easy example is dyslexia is not really a problem if you have a non-reading culture.
Right.
Which is why they think it's prevalent today, is there are other advantages. It just becomes a very big issue when you have such a text-heavy society. And one of the things they find is when you begin to read, period, it changes how we remember information, because all of a sudden it becomes less important to store it in your noggin because you can refer to it on the page. And they've done studies of people, like, tested their memorization skills before and after learning to read, and they have found a significant difference in the accuracy of memory once you learn how to read. Because we see this now today, that there are certain things that we don't need to remember because we have Google, and our brain knows we have Google. Which is why I am actually rotten at remembering, like, chapter and verse of where Bible verses are. It's because when I have a question of like where something is in the Bible, my brain knows I can just look it up real quick. And you all have seen me do this in Bible study. So all of that goes to say that this nomadic tribe is not literate. They do not have a text. This is when it becomes really important. When is this written down? Which is when we find it is written. This story is probably written down onto some piece of paper, like 1,000 years after the story took place. But in that intervening time, this is word of mouth, oral history, which is why repetition is so common. Repetition helps our brains remember, and there's a lot of tools, which is why we get the recitation of the entire family history. These are the children of this person, and then it cues the rest of the line in your head. And there's a question of how trustworthy is it? But the studies indicate that the trustworthiness of oral history increases if they are not literate, which is fascinating.
Makes total sense.
Yeah, Larry?
But it makes you think of that parlor game where you lined up and persons at one end made a statement and it got passed down the whole line. And
Yeah.
at the end, it was nothing like what started, you know.
Yeah, but Mary Ellen?
Well, this is taking me back to one of our New Testament studies, but I was asking in the New Testament when people were arriving in Bethlehem, how did they know who all these people, strangers, were, who was family and who wasn't? And your answer was, who can recite the lineage? And, if you can recite my family lineage, then you're family. And, so I'm seeing a parallel here.
So thank you, Mary Ellen, for bringing that out of remembering your family was very important, and there was ways to do it. The other thing that I think is an interesting way to look at this of like how accurate is this game of telephone is the fact that we have 4 different versions of the story stitched together. And how close do we see the stories, and where do we see the things diverge? And the fact that this part of the story, it's very clear that this is very piecemeal because of how the language is jumping back and forth between calling people various names. We do have this priestly lineage that this is very much a priestly insertion of like, here's the family. But the fact that like the stories are diverging and then kind of converging again shows that certain stories were remembered with higher accuracy than others. Even while there seems to be some differences, there's overlapping agreement on what happened. So when we talked about like how the Noah story, there seems to be 2 versions that merged into one, and when things happened multiple times that are similar but not quite the same, that's when we see the game of telephone, and we can kind of guess with how far apart the stories got before they were like stitched back together, we can see that game of telephone. What details were remembered and how did we make them work together again? We see this, or Mary Ellen, you brought up the Gospels. So we have the Synoptic Gospels that all kind of use the same source. And so that's like one version of the story that all three of them use. But then we have the Gospel of John, which is an entirely different timeline. And some people have tried to stitch it together in a similar way, and it just doesn't work as well. Like, one of the questions is like, when did Jesus go and flip the tables in the temple? And the Synoptics, the three that agree, have it at the very end. The Gospel of John, it's like chapter 2. It's like one of the first things Jesus does is go to the temple and flip the tables, and he's back and forth to Jerusalem all the time. He's like hanging out in Jerusalem, making people mad. And then the Synoptics, he really doesn't go to Jerusalem until the end. And so we can see how in the Jesus version of the story, the stories diverged, and we have a lot of trouble making them make sense together. But they were also much quicker to write down, which is fascinating, compared to the Genesis story, where there was much more time between the stories as they were and when they had to piece them back together, and they're actually a lot closer. So
the Gospel of John is so different. It's so much more abstract and sort of Gnostic, and Jesus was there from the beginning of time, which I think is pretty weird. And so they're appealing to a entirely different audience, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, but so it is an entirely different story with an entirely different purpose. But there's a lot of people who have struggled with the fact that they fundamentally do not agree on a timeline. And if you're trying to say that like it's that the Gospels have to agree, you run into some really hard things of like trying to choose because some of our favorite stories come from the Gospel of John, but they don't match up with the Synoptics, and the question is, how do we make them make sense? But that question is for another day if we ever study the Gospel of John, which is a whole other cup of tea. But with about 10 minutes left, let's get the end of this chapter in Genesis. So we have the promise, Jacob is coming to the land of Egypt. We have the promise of God. We have the lineage, so we make sure we know exactly who is coming to Egypt. And then we actually jump back into kind of the story as we know it. And we see that Israel sent Judah to Joseph. So we have one of the brothers kind of going ahead of the caravan to send word. So they arrive in the land of Goshen, and we have this reunion of father and son together, where finally they see each other face to face after much anticipation.
And many years.
And many, many years, right. So any thoughts on this reunion and how it compares to like the brothers' reunion and their reaction?
Well, the brothers were suspicious, kind of, with their reunion of, what was Joseph's intent, and this was too good to be true, kind of a thing going on. But this was just the joy, in my mind, of father and son being reunited. No hidden motives, no suspicions of whatever. This is just happiness on both sides.
Joseph probably realizes his father doesn't have much longer to live, too. And he's so glad to see him before he's dying.
So now this is once again kind of jumping to a gospel. Is there a parable that this almost sounds like?
Yeah, well, wait a minute.
Prodigal son.
Prodigal son.
For you were dead and now you are alive.
Right. Yeah.
and you have kind of the distrust of the older brothers and the younger brother taking a different path, and kind of this reunion that we can kind of see that the prodigal son almost echoes this reunion here, where the joy of the father and this idea of like, you were dead and now you're alive again.
Except that Joseph hasn't been doing naughty things.
Right. You're yeah, Joseph has not been squandering his wealth.
Well,
But yeah, in different circumstances, but this is where you can kind of,
Language. The language is similar.
you can kind of see how Jesus may have been like playing with a story that was semi-familiar. Jesus's words would likely kind of echo this story that would be in people's minds of like, what does a reunion of father and son look like? So, but that said, we then get Joseph said to his brothers that I will go and tell Pharaoh and say to him, my brothers and my father's household were in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of livestock. They have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. And this is one of those interesting moments where we see kind of the stitching together of stories, because we already got this of Joseph telling Pharaoh beforehand, and like Pharaoh sending the carts ahead. You can kind of see this comes from a different tradition. Like, if that didn't happen, this is the other version of Joseph. Like, they are arriving and then Joseph saying to Pharaoh, oh, my family's here. But we get this one detail that I think explains a question we had last time of when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our ancestors, in order that we may settle in the land of Goshen, because shepherds are abhorrent to Egyptians. And so the question is, why are they in the Goshen? It's because Egypt doesn't like shepherds. And I think this is once again one of those class distinctions. Shepherds, even like your wealthy shepherds, are going to be living much closer to the land, and it's considered a dirty profession. You're dealing with animals, you're dealing with birth, you're dealing with like slaughtering and maintenance. And most cultures that have a sense of cleanliness and metropolitanness, they don't want to touch the dirty animals. They'll eat the meat, but there's often a class distinction of like, the people working with animals should stay away from the city. Us city people are clean.
you don't want an abattoir in your neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. So any other thoughts about this story, which is once again more of connective tissue between the stories? Any other details you all found?
Oh.
All right. Well, we can wrap up a few minutes early. This one's a little bit more straightforward, little less life lessons in connection. We kind of are just seeing where the story is going.
It would be interesting, I think, to follow up with Exodus, but that's a bit of a slog, but I think it would be interesting.
Okay. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
A couple of weeks ago, we were talking about what we were going to do next, and you gave us several options to do. And I agree with Sue. I would like to continue with the story and find out what all the intrigue and whatever is going on in the backstory of all of this. So I agree with Sue. I'd like to continue.
Okay.
I agree.
All right, because we kind of, I mean, as we kind of talked about, we're kind of setting up for the next big plot. I'm hearing from you, it makes sense to keep going. We want to know what's happening. So anyone object to continuing on to Exodus after this?
I think it's a good idea.
Okay.
Oh,
I will say Exodus is really, really interesting. And if you want a different way to experience it other than reading it, I will say that like how I understood the story fundamentally changed when I got an audiobook of the Bible, but specifically, there is one in particular that I absolutely love. It is called the Bible Experience. And it's not, my mom told me to get James Earl Jones reading the Bible. And while that version is lovely because James Earl Jones is a great reader, the thing with the Bible Experience that changes kind of how things, or how I heard it, how I understood some of the story, is that it has the full movie production. And so they have a lot of sound effects as if it is a movie score. And Exodus really has I love the version of Exodus that is a part of, it's called the Bible Experience. I'll see if I can link you all to it if you all like listening to stories, because they read in a very dynamic way. If you, the entirety of the Bible Experience, if you get both Old and New Testament, it has like Samuel Jackson in it. And like Eartha Kitt, I think, is one of the characters in the beginning of Genesis. And they have like a lot of
The
really
snake.
big name. I think Denzel Washington is the one who reads the Song of Songs. So they have actual actors and voice actors doing the Bible Experience, but highly recommend it, especially for Exodus. The additional thing where it's helpful is Exodus begins as a story, and we kind of get the continuation. About halfway through, it turns into like a prelude to Leviticus, and we get the beginning of the laws and the commandments. So like, if Leviticus is a little bit thick for you to, or like one commandment after another, I will give you a heads up. That is the end of Exodus, is laying out some of the basic commandments, which is when audio versions come in handy, is because hearing someone read some of the starting laws and commandments is a lot better than trying to slog through it sometimes on the text. So that is a heads up, but I will put together a schedule since it sounds like Exodus is our next one.
Great.
Good.
So I guess my final question for you all is, next week is Holy Week. I am fine to meet if you all still want to gather for Bible study. The week after, I am on vacation though, so I will not be with you all.
I'll be away next week.
Other thoughts?
I'll be here.
we've got company next week, so, you know, we can try to attend, but it might be an issue.
I might be able to tune in. I don't know what's going on, what will be going on. 10 o'clock to 11 isn't, my sister might just be coming.
Okay.
I never know.
All right. So let's plan on it. And if you're not gonna, if it doesn't look like it's gonna work out for you, send me a message. My threshold is having 2 or 3 other people is kind of a good number to have a full conversation about things. All right, sounds good. So we know what's coming up ahead. Shall we pray out for today?
Yes.
Good and gracious God, we see how even as we wrap up one part of a story, that God, you are a God of stories upon stories, and that your story continues. It's always exciting to see both the stories of how you have interacted with people in bygone ages and how you're still interacting with our stories today. We're just gracious that you have invited us into your story of creation, and your story of life, and your story of love and redemption, forgiveness, and all the ups and downs, that we are able to be a part of it. So I ask that you bless the people here, that they may see you as a part of their story, that they may see you this week in the ways that you're moving in this world, and the ways that you move in the world as a part of other people's stories. So we give you thanks until we join together again to return to the story of your people. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
And
All right. Thank you all.
see you
Chris.
next week.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.